Welcome to the webinar hosted by the 21st Century China Center. I am Victor Shih, Associate Professor in the School of Global Policy and Strategy and Ho Mu Chair in China and Pacific Relations. Thank you for joining us today. This webinar is recorded and will be available on our website, china.ucsd.edu. Please use the Q&A function on the bottom of your screen to submit your questions. I'll be reading the questions you submit for our speaker during the Q&A portion of the seminar, which is the latter half of it. Today, we're very delighted to have Dr. Jennifer Pan with us. Professor Pan is an Associate Professor of Communication and Associate Professor of Political Science and Sociology at Stanford University. Her research resides at the intersection of political communication and authoritarian politics, showing how authoritarian governments try to control society, how the public responds, and when and why each is successful. Her work has appeared in peer-reviewed publications such as the American Political Science Review, American Journal of Political Science, Journal of Politics, and also Science, which is a more general journal, of course. And we're very excited to have her here today. After Dr. Pan's presentation, I will start a conversation. Then we'll open it up to Q&A. So again, welcome to virtually to UCSD, Jen. Oh, you're muted still.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. Today, I'm going to talk to you about a paper called Reframing China, Counter-Narrative Strategies of Chinese State Media on Twitter. And this is joint work with Yingjie Fan and Jamie Sheng. So in the past few years, media outlets controlled by the Chinese Communist Party have been really aggressive at expanding their presence on global social media platforms. As of today, China's premier outward-facing state-controlled media outlet, CGTN, has hundreds of millions of followers on Twitter, YouTube, and Facebook. And there's been a lot of discussion about what these efforts mean. China has expanded its international media presence, but is this public diplomacy? Is this soft power? Is this sharp power? Is this propaganda? Are these influence operations? So part of the disagreement stems from the inherent fuzziness and, I would say, conceptual stretching of concepts such as soft power. But there's also disagreement because of the lack of basic empirical description of what messages China's international media outlets are disseminating. And so in today's talk, what I'll share with you is a quantitative description of all tweets made by CGTN from 2013 to 2020. And I'll start by just first describing the presence of CGTN as an outlet on Twitter. I'll hone in on the content of their tweets. Then I'll put what CGTN puts out in the context of the global media environment and international reporting on China. As a bit of background, outward media is not a new thing for China or the CCP. It happened in the Maoist era, and with economic reforms, party leaders, including Deng, really wanted to try to tell the world about new China and make the world aware of changes taking place in China. But even though the intention was to tell the world about China, for the most part, in the 1990s and 2000s, outward messaging was really reactive. It was really reactive to negative international media coverage of domestic Chinese events. So think Tiananmen democracy movement in 1989, SARS in 2003, unrest in Tibet in 2008. In many of these cases, the CCP imposed limitations on media, especially foreign media reporting. And as a result, journalists had to go to other sources. So for example, if you think back to 2008, there was unrest in Tibet. The Chinese government prohibited foreign media outlets from entering Tibet. And as a result, international media outlets relied on information released by the Tibetan government in exile in India. And what resulted were news reports that were much more critical of China than Beijing had expected. And so throughout the 1990s and 2000s, outward media from the CCP is just reacting to these negative international coverage of China. And I think part of that has led to these perceptions among, I would say, the public, but also CCP leadership, that international media is biased against China. And so a motivation more recently for China's outward media efforts is the correct misconceptions about China. Efforts ramped up under Hu and then have intensified under Xi. So starting in 2007, Hu Jintao launched new campaigns to try to influence global perceptions. And the focus then was on hosting mega events. Big example would be the 2008 Summer Olympics in Beijing. But in addition, there were also efforts to promote Chinese language and culture through Confucius Institutes and just strengthen China's international media presence. In 2013, under Xi, there was an immediate emphasis on the need for China to continue to build on what Hu had done in shaping global public opinion. This is a frequently cited quote from Xi's speech in the August 2013 National Propaganda and Ideological Work Conference, where he called on the CCP to innovate on external publicity methods, strive to create new ideas, new categories, new narratives for domestic and foreign audiences, to tell Chinese stories well, and to spread Chinese voices well. A number of action plans and bureaucratic restructuring followed this pronouncement. And among them was a consolidation and rebranding of several channels of China Central Television, CCTV, into a single channel, China Global Television Network, CGTN. They've gotten rid of all the red. It's new branding, new logos, new name. And by the end of 2016, beginning 2017, CGTN, along with China National Radio and China Radio International, formed a new media conglomerate that with a much more elevated political status. And so what we do is collect 115,000 tweets made by CGTN, as well as associated metadata from January 2013 to September 2020. So note that CGTN didn't come into being until end of 2016, beginning of 2017. But that Twitter account was previously in existence. It just was a CCTV Twitter account. So there's data from that account going back to 2013. We also collect the entire follower list for CGTN as of June 2020. So that's 13.9 million followers. For each follower account, we collected the account username, screen name, bio, location, if they had that, number of tweets, and other metadata. We focus on CGTN's English language account on Twitter to maximize the geographic scope of the analysis while taking into account some of the limitations imposed by the access to data that we have. Focusing on English language content lets us look at CGTN audiences in Africa, Asia, India, Australia, Europe, and North America. It does limit our view of CGTN activity in South America and the Middle East, but based on follower data, we do see CGTN followers from countries like Brazil, Venezuela, Egypt, and Iraq. To put the activities of CGTN into context of the global media environment, we also collected all the tweets made by 6 international media outlets: BBC Breaking News, CNN Breaking News, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, Fox News, and Russia Today, between January 2013 and September 2020. So we chose these outlets to have a diversity of types. So some are breaking news, some are not, of ideological slant, of ownership structure, and also the size of the social media followership. So as you'll see, BBC Breaking News and CNN Breaking News have way more followers than the other outlets. And we also finally include RT as a point of comparison for another state-controlled media outlet with a prominent international presence. Okay, so looking at what is the presence of CGTN on Twitter, this figure compares the number of followers of CGTN with that of other media outlets. And this is from October 2020. And what we can see here is that CGTN has the largest Twitter following of any Chinese state-controlled media outlet. So those are the bars in black. So more followers in Xinhua than People's Daily. CGTN also has way more followers on Twitter than RT, which is to the left of the plot. And then CGTN has slightly fewer followers than Washington Post and Wall Street Journal, which are in the light gray. And as I mentioned before, CNN breaking news, BBC breaking news have orders of magnitude more followers. A lot changed for the CGTN Twitter account before and after rebranding. So this figure shows the total number of tweets per week, and we can see that the tweet volume increases substantially shortly after the beginning of 2017 and stays at that sustained rate going forward. CGTN followership also ramps up after the rebranding at the start of 2017, and it quickly outpaces that of followership for RT, which is in the light gray here in comparison. Here, the x-axis is time, the y-axis is cumulative followers. So one note here is just that Twitter doesn't provide the exact date someone started following an account, but we can infer the earliest possible following date from the list of followers, because when you collect that from Twitter, they have a created at metadata timestamp. Okay, so what this plot really shows is the cumulative CGTN followers based on the earliest possible following date. You might wonder, they ramped up really quick. It seems a very linear increase. Was this authentic, or was this somehow fueled by bots? We actually find little to indicate that followers of CGTN are bots, or more likely to be bots than any other media outlet on Twitter. We look at lots of different indicators of bot-like or inauthentic activity. This particular figure shows just one metric. So this is the proportion of followers without a timeline. And that's comparing CGTN in black to the Washington Post in light gray. Again, this is over time. Y-axis is proportion of followers with no timeline. You can see in that the past few years, especially since rebranding, the proportion of followers with no timeline is very similar between CGTN and Washington Post. And if I showed you the other international media outlets, the proportion they're all very similar. Okay, so then turning to the content of CGTN tweets, because the characteristics of CGTN's Twitter account changed so much after the rebranding, in this and the next section, I'm gonna focus on CGTN content from 2017 onward after the rebranding is complete. So this is a stacked area plot of the number of tweets made by CGTN about China in light gray. And things about China include tweets about China's domestic affairs, as well as China's relations with other countries on the international stage. So, and then in dark gray are tweets completely unrelated to China. And this is from 2017 to 2020. Here, we're just identifying tweets about China through regular expression pattern matching based on a list of terms and phrases related to China, like cities, provinces, as well as patterns like CCP, Belt and Road, and a number of others. So looking at this figure over time, what we can see is that tweets about China are consistently slightly less than half of all of CGTN tweets. The average for this period is 43%. There's a slight increase in the relative proportion of tweets about China in the latter half of 2019, and this is because of protests in Hong Kong. And then there's a relative decrease in the share of China-related tweets in the second quarter of 2020 as COVID-19 spread globally. So there was a rise in the number of tweets because of COVID, but there's actually a smaller share about China as there's a lot of news about how COVID is spreading in countries other than China. But so our focus for this paper, at least, is primarily on how does CGTN talk about China? So we're going to focus on tweets related to China. But I think before I get into that, one takeaway I want to note from this figure is that more than half of CGTN content is completely unrelated to China. And what they're doing is reporting on breaking events. We also did an analysis comparing CGTN tweets to a list of events. And we find that there's a really high coverage of events, very similar to what BBC breaking news and CNN breaking news covers. So in other words, a lot of what CGTN is tweeting about is breaking news similar to what any international media outlet is doing. Okay, so then when we explore data, first we explore data by classifying several hundred CGTN tweets by hand. And what we find through this exploratory analysis is that tweets about China consistently emphasize a number of positive attributes about China. And these attributes align exactly with the detailed strategy for shaping national image that Xi Jinping laid out in 2013. In this speech, Xi lays out 4 core narratives of China's national image with sub-narratives in each. I think if you just look at these 4 core narratives, it's actually a little hard to understand what's going on. But let's look in detail in each. So the first is that China is a country with great civilization. What this means is rich history and ethnic diversity and harmony. That's the civilization part. The second, China as a leader in East Asia. This has lots of different facets. So this narrative emphasizes China's transparent government, China's economic development, China's flourishing culture, China's social stability, China's unity, and China's culture and beauty. So that's leader in East Asia. The third is China as a responsible country on the international stage. These narratives emphasize China's desire to pursue peaceful development, mutual development, cooperation, non-confrontation. China contributes to international development, defends international justice, contributes to humanity. And then the last category is China as a success of socialism. So usually we might think of socialism as something about economic redistribution, but that's not the case for this narrative. China as a success of socialism is really these narratives of China being open to the outside, approachable, hopeful, vibrant, and a country that seeks to deconstruct Western discourse hegemony. And that this part of deconstructing Western discourse hegemony is the one place in which you see CGTN directly arguing against what Western leaders and media outlets say about China. Okay, so from a theoretical perspective, we treat these narratives as frames for China. So when we think about attitudes, so people have attitudes about objects, things, issues, policies, events, countries, people, and that attitude consists of multiple attributes, so the attributes I, and then the attitude is a sum of some product of the individual's evaluation of the attribute and the salience weight of each attribute. So CGTN narratives seek to change the salience of certain attributes of China by emphasizing things like China's cooperation, governmental transparency, rich culture, and natural beauty. So we're calling this reframing, even though what's going on is framing, because the attributes that CGTN emphasizes differs from what international reporting emphasizes. So then to systematically analyze how tweets fall into these reframing narratives, we first randomly sample 1,000 tweets, stratified by month, to determine whether a tweet contains content related to any of the 4 meta framing categories. And if not, if yes, what is a sub-narrative? And then if not, does it relate to breaking news, or is it soft news, like an entertainment topic that doesn't fall into any of the reframing narratives? Then based on this hand-labeled data, we train and compare 3 binary classification models with lots of different feature combinations. And what we find is that a logistic regression model with unigram and word embedding features performs the best. And we trained 3 of those models to identify reframing, breaking news, and soft news. Okay, so then when we classify posts using these models, we find that the vast majority of tweets related to China contain reframing narratives throughout the period from 2017, starting especially the latter half of 2017 through 2020. This represents 76% of all tweets about China can be considered reframing, and the remaining portion is primarily breaking news that we can't put in any of the reframing categories, and then a little bit of entertainment, soft news that doesn't contain any of those reframing narratives. If we dig into the sub-narratives based on the hand coding, we find that economic development, China's economic development, and China's cooperation on the international stage are the most frequently emphasized. And then this is followed by tweets about China's rich culture and natural beauty, and then posts refuting Western discourse hegemony. So these are posts that argue against points made in international media reporting. So one thing to know is what's not here. There's no narrative or sub-narrative that pushes a particular China model of political or economic institutions or development. There are elements of what people might consider a China model in economic development and stability and in refuting Western discourse hegemony. But the emphasis here in what CGTN is doing and talking about China is that it's all about China. It's about what China is doing, how it's great at what it's doing. It's not at all about what other countries should or should not do. Okay, so from this figure, CGTN is clearly using these narratives all the time. But we also look at two particular cases, protests in Hong Kong and COVID, to show how in response to events, these narratives are often deployed. So during Hong Kong protests, CGTN would argue against points made by international media outlets by using these narratives. For example, when the Wall Street Journal said that Hong Kong was losing its special luster, CGTN would say, emphasize Hong Kong's economic prosperity. When Wall Street Journal talks about China's influence in Hong Kong elections, CGTN says that is congratulating the winner of the election, but then also says hashtag HK elections are open, fair, and just. We see something similar with COVID. So when international media outlets talk about the negative impact of COVID on China's economic growth and growth metrics, CGTN will say economic growth will continue. In transparency, when international media outlets question China's transparency when it comes to sharing information about COVID, CGTN will emphasize the Chinese government's transparency, which aligns with the broader narratives around government and political transparency. And we see the same thing when it comes to cooperation. CGTN emphasizes China's cooperation and with other countries during COVID, and argues that the Western countries are putting China in a particular spot, whereas China really wants to cooperate. Okay, what's important here is that clearly there's a refutation going on, but the narratives, those messages from the narratives of cooperation, of transparency, or growth are continually emphasized. So then to put CGTN in the context of the global media environment and international reporting on China, CGTN doesn't exist in isolation. It's competing for audiences and attention in a free media environment. So how does it compare? So first, CGTN content about China is, as you might expect, much less negative than reporting on China by other international media outlets. So we're using an existing dictionary-based approach of sentiment classification. And here, this plot is showing on the y-axis the percent of tweets related to China with negative sentiment. And each bar is a different media outlet. And we're showing you the data from 2017 to 2020. So what we find is that approximately half of Wall Street Journal and Fox News reporting on China contains negative sentiment. For Washington Post, CNN, and BBC, this is around 60%. And then for CGTN, it's much lower, around 25%. So one thing to emphasize, with a couple of things that might be surprising here. One thing that might be surprising to I think maybe audiences in China is that the Western media outlets aren't actually more negative. And the other surprising thing is that CGTN is at all negative. But I think one thing to note here is that this is sentiment, which is distinct than, let's say, criticism. So you could have criticism that's framed in a positive way, and maybe that wouldn't get picked up. But similarly, you could have negative sentiment expressing dismay at a certain situation, let's say in China, but that actually doesn't contain any criticism. So I think that's just a thing to keep in mind when we talk about negative sentiment, as opposed to something much more specific like criticism. We also did hand coding from CGTN, BBC, and CNN, where we did look not just at sentiment, but criticisms of China, its system, its leaders, its policies. And there we find directionally very similar patterns, both from CGTN and the international media outlets. Okay, so remember that after 2017, that volume of CGTN content really shot up, right? So in this stacked area plot, we're comparing the number of tweets produced by CGTN that contain reframing narratives about China with all tweets about China made by Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, Fox News, and CNN Breaking News, BBC Breaking News. So obviously there are many other international media outlets that report on China, but what this shows is that if we only look at CGTN reframing content, the amount of content vastly outstrips content about China produced by any one international media outlet. And in fact, CGTN produces more reframing content about China than Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, Fox News, CNN, and BBC combined during our time period. But as I mentioned, CGTN is competing for attention, and CGTN content receives less engagement. So these bar plots show the median engagement, likes on the left, replies in the middle, and retweets on the right, with each tweet per 1 million followers from CGTN, which is in dark gray at the top, with Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, Fox News, CNN, and BBC. So this is only showing reframing tweets for CGTN. And what you can see is that engagement, Twitter users engage less with CGTN reframing content than content produced by other international media outlets about China. Okay. So what are the implications of this? I want to highlight two, and then I'll conclude the talking portion. The first is that CGTN has to compete in a free media environment for attention. It's invested in greatly boosting the volume of its content and in reporting on international breaking news. And in fact, if you look at what tweet over our time period had the highest engagement, it was when CGTN broke the news about the death of the Thai king. That is the most retweeted, replied, liked post from CGTN from 2017 to 2020. So this high volume content reporting on breaking news seems to be at least some of the ways in which CGTN is trying to compete in a free media environment. The second implication is, so what do we make of this activity? Going back to the beginning of my talk. Is this soft power, sharp power propaganda? So this really depends on how we define deception. CGTN content does not contain any lies. So there's no deception through lying. But if we believe that deception also includes omission, distortion, misdirection, then maybe it is engaged in deception. But the thing to consider there is that if we think about the communication of soft power, it's almost inevitable by design that if you communicate a country's soft power, you're going to be emphasizing certain attributes that are positive about that country at the expense of others. And so there's going to be omission happening by design if you're communicating soft power. So ultimately, I think how we kind of delineate or what do we call these activities depends on what we think constitutes deception. And if we think, and if deception does go beyond lies to omission, distortion, and misdirection, then there's some argument to say that any communication act of soft power is deceptive. And in that case, what China and CGTN is doing is not an exception, but the norm to that. So thank you so much for having me. I look forward to the discussion.
Yeah, thank you, Jen. This is a very rich line of inquiry, as all of your research is. So there are a lot of questions. I guess I will kick it off with one kind of theoretical or kind of more conceptual question that Lei and I both have, actually. And then one question, actually just out of selfish reason, I want to know the best practice on how to train RAs to hand classify some of these tweets. We have the same, probably less challenging than what you have. But one of the issues that I think of is like, well, all the RAs come into the hand coding with their own biases. So what is the best practice to make sure that they're more or less on the same page when they're hand classifying things into different categories? That's a technical question. The more kind of conceptual question I have for you is that Lei and I are both interested in the tweets that are not about China, right? So just because they're not about China doesn't mean that these tweets do not serve the soft power of the Chinese government. There's research by one of my students, Patrick Chester, which suggests that China intentionally makes, some democracies, especially elections, look bad. Do we see patterns like that? There's other research that shows that sometimes coverage in countries with a lot of overseas Chinese aims at sort of dividing the overseas Chinese from their host government, from their governments, and sort of get them closer to China. Whether that is a possibility on Twitter, because it is so commonly used by people around the world.
Yeah, no, thank you for that question. We actually spent a lot of time looking at those tweets and not about China, especially at that point about, is it making democracies look bad? Is it making authoritarian control? And because during this time period, there are some countries where there's some reversion toward authoritarianism, even in transitional hybrid regimes. How does China portray those situations? And what we find is that China does not describe those any differently than BBC or CNN. It's not, we used a lot of different types of methods, but it doesn't have any more negative association with democracies or any more positive associations with democracies, with autocracies or autocratic strategies, like valuing efficiency over representation, over getting things done quickly at the expense of input, things like that. We don't see kind of any emphasis from CGTN that's any different than what BBC or CNN are doing. There is more reporting on China's trade partners. And I think people have found that in non-social media with what Chinese media in general emphasizes. So when we look at trade partners or Belt and Road countries, there's just relatively more coverage of those. So those are the patterns that we found. I think in terms of overseas Chinese, I don't think the data set we have can really answer that, because we're looking at English language CGTN, and there is Chinese language state outward media is its own thing. And we collected that data, but that content is quite different than the English content. And so we didn't want to put it into this paper, but that I think might be a place to look for. Is there kind of efforts at division or efforts to gain loyalty or something with overseas Chinese? But that would be with the Chinese language. To the second question of best practices to trade RAs, the hand classified tweets, I think really the key for us has been to write down very clearly the coding rules, to have multiple RAs code the same post according to those rules, and to iterate on that at least 3 times. Because you give them the rules, they're going to go code, and then they're not going to agree. Like the first time, maybe there's only 50% agreement. And then what we do is we all sit down, like me, the graduate students who are working on the paper, and all the coders, we go through every disagreement and we talk about why there's that disagreement. We revise the rules, and then we do that at least 2 more times. And I think we reach a point where generally there's clarity on what each category is. We can never come to 100% agreement on all the content, because there's just some that are like border case. There's some that are just really hard to say. And so once we get to about 80% or more agreement, then we stop and say, this is the coding rule, and then we give it to them to follow. But it's definitely always an iterative process. And I would say some things are easier, some topics are easier than others, just precisely because, as you say, there's some areas in which the RAs coming in have more preconceived notions than others.
Yeah, thank you. That's very helpful. That will really help our project out as we try to train these RAs. So a lot of questions building up. So there are still, despite your wonderful chart, there's still these questions about bots, potential bots that are following these accounts. I also noticed in the chart that you present, there are like these huge spikes of new. I mean, I think the chart is showing new followers for these CGTN accounts, right? So there are sometimes there's like 50%, are people without any timelines. So if you present like a cumulative picture, what does it look like? You should be able to calculate the share of followers without, timelines when they first followed the account or something like that. There's another related question about why is the engagement of CGTN Twitter accounts so low? Is the engagement data consistent with the follower count?
Yeah, so on the first one of cumulative, I think so it could be that in 2014, CGTN, or at this point, it was the CCTV channel, was trying to experiment with bots to boost followers. And that's why in that earlier period, we see more kind of bot activity. But then I think the other thing to keep in mind is that Twitter as a platform has worked really hard, especially after 2016, to cut down on bot activity, especially coordinated activity by bot-like or inauthentic accounts. And so I think potentially this was a problem, an issue in the past, but really after looking at data past 2016, there's very little bot-like activity. Because let me just share the slide. This is the slide that shows proportion of followers with no timeline. So you see these big peaks in the 2014, 2015 time period. I think this was also when they had just much fewer followers. But then really there's not these big jumps after 2016. I think this is both because of, I think this is likely due to what the platform and what Twitter is doing to cut down on bot accounts. Then in terms of why engagement is so low, so I wouldn't say that it's absolutely terrible. So here, let me go to this figure again. So on likes, it does better than Washington Post and Wall Street Journal, like in the median. It doesn't do as well with replies, and I wonder if this is because CGTN doesn't engage in conversation after the conversation starts. And so I think that really limits its engagement when it comes to replies. It's not going to, if someone replies to CGTN and says something about its tweet, it's not going to reply and say anything back. Whereas some of these other media outlets do that. Okay. But again, like with retweets, CGTN is very similar to Fox News. It's not like it's extremely different than every other outlet. Obviously, I think the other thing to know from this is that there is variation between outlets. Like BBC performs way better than all of these others. Kind of understanding why that is might also help us understand why CGTN's engagement is relatively lower.
Yeah, so there's a related question actually from Molly. Do you think the Twitter policy more recently to label CGTN as a state media, did that have any kind of causal effect to lower engagement level or even marginal increase in new followers?
Yeah, so that's something that we want to look at that kind of what's happening right before and after that shift. And it's not clear. Yeah, so that's something we want to look into, but we haven't. Which we will.
Right, great. So there's a question from Tom Gold. So there are foreigners who work for CGTN. Do you guys detect any signs that, maybe at first the official message is kind of harsh, but then maybe some of the foreigners who work at CGTN is like, no, you can't possibly put things that way. Let's soften up the language a little bit. I mean, are there sort of examples of, I guess, tweets that get reposted sometimes and then the language sort of changes?
Yeah, no, it'd be interesting to look at tweets that are deleted and then reposted to see if there's a change in language. But what seems to be the case is that it's a lot of people who are working, and this is more from interviews that we did as we were going through this project. A lot of people, both Chinese nationals and non-Chinese nationals who work for CGTN are, I would call them media professionals. They're like trained, they're majoring or they've had experience working for international media outlets, either as in journalism, others have experience in marketing and PR. So a lot of these people are coming into the organization, regardless of their nationality, with a lot of training on persuasion, especially coming from advertising and campaigning, and in addition to journalism.
Yeah, yeah. I think we both probably have had students who are doing stuff like that. So a question from one of our graduate students, one is it possible to know how many CGTN followers out of the total are users geolocated outside of China or foreigners outside of China? The second question is, could you give us some examples of CGTN tweets with negative sentiment toward China?
Okay, for the first one, let me share this slide. So these percentages are very small. So these are followers of CGTN who allow Twitter to have their actual geographic location. That's a small minority of Twitter users. But just looking at these people, this is the distribution of where they're coming from based on the geographic location metadata. So a lot from India, Nigeria, Brazil, Pakistan, then US. I think the main thing here that's surprising to some people, one is that this is people from outside of China. China is here, but primarily these are followers from outside of China. And it's primarily people who are not in developed consolidated democracies. So it's not the case that most followers are in US or North America and Europe. They're primarily from other countries and regions. In terms of, sorry, there was a second part to that question.
What is an example of
a
negative tweet about China?
Yeah, so negative sentiment tweet about China could be a tweet talking about the difficulty of dealing with environmental pollution. So it's a kind of, it's a piece about how natural beauty in China is being negatively impacted by pollution, how the government is trying hard to solve this problem, but it's a very difficult problem to solve. So that would be a message with negative sentiment.
Be classified as negative? It's like, oh, there's a typhoon, it destroyed, 20 buildings. Like, would that be classified?
That would be negative sentiment too. Yeah. So that's why negative sentiment is different than criticism. It could or could not overlap with criticism.
Right. Although, I mean, for weather, I would maybe net that out and see what the results look like. Because I do notice that there's a lot of kind of weather related
yes,
in the spirit of breaking news,
yeah, there's weather, there's building collapses, other unexpected things that happen, and oftentimes they have negative impacts, and so they contain negative sentiment.
We have kind of a, I guess, more provocative question. What action should the free press, I guess, Western media take to counter the PRC's media warfare? Well, I guess another way of putting it is kind of toward the end, what you said is China is trying to portray soft power. So then it's highlighting certain facts. That's a kind of a media strategy. So in the research on media strategy, what are some ways to balance that? I mean, besides just saying that, okay, now then we will present negative facts. Like besides that, which of course you show that Washington Post and Wall Street Journal, they do that. They portray more negative news about China. But what else can media do just in general, right? Not necessarily just against China or whatever, but like, if you see a media that's very positive, what do you do to balance against that?
So one way to think about it is positive and negative. But I actually wonder if another way to think about it is what stories do you tell? And in doing this research and in presenting this work, I often encounter so people look at that plot of negative sentiment, and a lot of Chinese nationals don't believe that negative sentiment from international media outlets are so low. They think I must be missing the negativity from international media to China. And so I actually think more critical content from international media is not going to change anyone's minds, at least in China. It's just going to reinforce that perception that the West cannot tolerate the rise of China. It's just going to feed into that narrative. But instead, if what CGTN is emphasizing particular attributes, then what other media could be doing are emphasizing other attributes and telling other stories that may not necessarily be negative, positive, but show a different view or tell a different story about China. And I think those could potentially resonate with, not lead to that backlash of China's domestic audience, and also show people who are outside of China a more nuanced view of what is happening in China, and what China's economic development, its foreign policy, its domestic policies, what those are and what their implications are.
Right. Thanks. So there's a question. I think this is good. In terms of comparative research, do you have any research, or do you plan on doing any research comparing China's soft power strategy relative to other countries? And I would add, including the U.S. I think VOA is very ineffective, and no one follows it. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe millions of people do it or something.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. So one thing to note is that BBC began as a state broadcast, right? Its ownership structure has separated it from the government, and it's perceived as a very legitimate, media outlet. So we have thought about comparing kind of what CGTN, and we do have the comparison of RT versus Today, and we have thought about comparing to Voice of America. I think one thing that we've noticed in doing this, and this is it's exploratory, is that one thing that differentiates CGTN from, let's say, VOA or even RT is that it is coming out of China, where already there are domestic controls on information. And so what it reports is a reflection of domestic media censorship. So VOA will report things that are reported in US media, like the top US headlines from CNN, Fox News, are sometimes found on VOA. And that already represents a wider range of views of things than you would see on CGTN, just because domestic reporting in China is much narrower. So I think that's where the domestic media environment also influences just the kind of characteristics of the outward media strategies.
Right. So another couple of questions from our grad student. Can you disentangle the sentiment of tweets by events? Meaning, does the negativity decrease when CGTN argues against Western criticism of particular events? Oh yeah, so yeah, does the negativity decrease or increase when CGTN argues against particular kinds of Western criticism of certain kinds of events? Also, why only CGTN? Does the volume of tweets reflect CGTN's relative budgetary power compared to other agencies rather than operational strategies?
Okay. So there's that particular category of refuting Western discourse hegemony. And that everything in that category tends to be very combative and uses kind of sharp language. So that if you're asking about that particular category, is there more negative sentiment? There is, but then there's also CGTN in response to particular events like COVID or protests in Hong Kong. And there, I wouldn't say we haven't seen that there's more negativity when they're responding to these events, because it seems that they're just deploying these narratives in those situations. So the overall narrative of cooperation, international cooperation, is a big one. And it is also very substantial when we look at how CGTN argues against Western coverage of specific events. I think the second question, why are we only looking at CGTN and not Xinhua or People's Daily? We actually did collect the posts from also People's Daily, tweets from People's Daily and Xinhua. But we focused on CGTN because it actually, compared to the other outlets, I didn't show engagement, but is the most engaged comparatively out of the other outlets. And so we wanted to focus on one outlet because it's also seems to be where the Chinese government is focusing its outward media efforts.
Yeah, but this is related to another question online here, which is that so you're looking at English language tweets, but they also tweet in Chinese, and then some of the other outlets, they also have Chinese content. Do we see coordination, a high degree of coordination across languages, across platforms, or do we see actually quite different content? I mean, this goes back to the sort of overseas Chinese question that we had earlier on. I think that would be worth exploring, you know.
Yeah. So one of the reasons why, actually there is no coordination between CGTN and Xinhua and People's Daily. Their content is different. And that was one of the reasons why we didn't look at Xinhua and People's Daily, because then everything would have tripled and things would have been different rather than showing kind of coordination. One thing we didn't look at is across platform. So CGTN, we looked at CGTN tweets. We didn't look at CGTN Facebook or CGTN YouTube. CGTN Facebook actually has the biggest following of any platform. And so I think that's something that we're interested potentially for the future, is looking across platform. And then also this link by language. Are they just translating the same tweets to Spanish and Arabic? Or is it different? I know for sure that the Chinese and English are different, but we didn't look into the other non-Chinese, non-English languages.
Yeah. So let's see. So there are more questions. Let's see. Try to ask you one more before we run out of time. Yeah, does the Chinese government have a Facebook account? And if so, what do you think it might look like, the content? Have you looked at it, I guess?
So China's outward media strategy is not through government accounts. It is through these media accounts. CGTN is one, and China Radio International. They're now a media conglomerate. They are the voice for the Chinese regime outside of its borders. And today, I mean, the other thing across platform is that we're just looking at social media, but we know that CGTN has developed really significant presence in broadcast media across many countries, South America, Sub-Saharan Africa, Middle East. And so those are traditional broadcasts. They have television stations where they're broadcasting. I think that's another area that's definitely worth studying, and which kind of is falling outside of, you know, what we're looking at is only a small piece of the overall strategy, but that strategy is really being driven not by government, there's no government account for the CCP, it's through state-controlled media.
Well, there's the joke account, the relevant organ, which
yeah.
No. So the final question. This is a very good one, actually. So, as you know, Chinese officials now have joined Twitter, and now they're tweeting. Do they get? Have you looked at data whether they get higher engagement per tweet? That they I mean, it seems like that is more effective. You have a real person or Hua Chunying or someone. Yes. How do you compare the performance, if you will, between big media accounts like CGTN versus individual tweeting?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really great question, and something that we would need to look into, actually analyze and gather data and compare empirically to really answer that question. But I would guess that there's a trade-off between audience and engagement, in the sense that CGTN, being a media outlet that has also broadcast presence, might be able to attract audiences beyond the kind of Twitterati that would follow these individuals who are online opinion leaders. My guess is that those individuals would get higher engagement, but they're likely reaching a narrower or just very different subpopulation of Twitter users than the media outlets.
Yeah, I mean, these people have day jobs, ambassador. they got some. I mean, it's not like me. I just tweet or whatever, like.
But also like the people following them are reporters are following them. Other academics follow them. I don't know how many ordinary users are following them. That's an empirical question.
They don't even know who these people are, right?
Yeah. Whereas they might say, oh, I've watched CGTN on TV. I might follow their account. They'll tell me some breaking news in countries that I care about, which CNN doesn't really report on. So it's a different kind of audience and different needs that potentially are being satisfied.
Well, thank you very much for an hour of very stimulating conversation. Like all of your other projects, this one sounds really interesting and amazing, and we further results. And please come back and join us for further conversations when you have other new results. And for the audience, thank you for joining us today. And but please pay attention to our next events. Here are some upcoming events. Next week, we have Rana Mitter from University of Oxford talking about his book, China's Good War, How Memory of World War II is Shaping a New Nationalism, a very timely topic related to this, sort of soft power propaganda issue. Then in December, we have two interesting events. John Yasuda from Johns Hopkins will talk about regulating China's stock market. I know this to be an issue, close to the interests of many of our audience member here. And then finally, on December 9th, we have Jessica Tietz from Middlebury College talking about civil society as social entrepreneurs. So please join us in thanking Professor Pan for giving presentation today. And I hope to see everyone here again soon. Thank you.